Welcome to our midweek Bible study. We're continuing on in Matthew chapter 16. And what we've been talking about is this issue that Jesus has been having with the religious leaders, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the scribes. And what's been going on is that Jesus has been having a conflict with them based around the idea that their traditions are just as important as his mission. Jesus has a mission of ushering in the kingdom, and the problem is that that kingdom is in conflict with the traditions and the oral law that the religious leaders have developed over the years. What happened is that the religious leaders of Israel have developed a whole bunch of additions to the law that was given to them at Sinai, and those for them carry basically the same weight as the law itself does. Now, in Matthew chapter 16, what we're experiencing in this chapter is that Jesus has just had this conflict started around the Sabbath and what his disciples and he did on the Sabbath. And then also the fact that his disciples did not cleanse themselves, wash their hands before eating a meal. And Jesus has talked about what defiles a person is what's in their heart, what comes out of them, not what goes into them. And then what happened is Jesus goes and there's a Canaanite woman in an area that he travels to that's largely Gentile. And that Canaanite woman shows great faith, and he heals many people in that area, and he feeds 4,000 really of Gentiles, just as he had fed 5,000 Jewish people earlier. So that's just taken place. He's just had this experience in the Gentile areas where his ministry has been accepted. So that's the context for this next passage starting in chapter 16, verse 1. And that context is really important for us because we have to read this next passage in light of what's been going on. This next round of conflicts with the religious leaders are going to come at as a result, or the nature of that conflict is going to be in light of both the previous conflict with those leaders and the fact that Gentiles have responded to his message of the kingdom. So let's go ahead and start reading chapter 16, verse 1. It says, "And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, 'When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except for the sign of Jonah.' So he left them and departed." So the issue here between Jesus and the religious leaders is that they're not looking for the truth here. They're not looking. This is not a test in good faith. It's not that they really are open to the ministry that Jesus has. The problem here is a basic fundamental problem where their conflict with Jesus is not because they don't think that he's the Messiah. Their conflict with Jesus has to do with the content of his ministry. Remember that this all started back when Jesus was healing on the Sabbath day, and the conflict had to do with the fact that their rules, their interpretation of the rules, did not allow for him to do these acts of mercy on the Sabbath day. And that came into conflict with the kingdom that he's inaugurating. One of the things that we have to understand in this is that the idea of a Sabbath is a covenant evaluation. Recall that a covenant is something that unifies two things. And when God gave the covenant to Israel at Sinai, what he was doing is he was uniting himself to Israel. And the question is, What is the result of that covenant? What is that covenant a good thing or a bad thing? Now, you can kind of think of this in terms of if you get married, you have, your first anniversary comes around. And in that moment, the goal or the hope is that you would celebrate that first anniversary. And what you're doing in the midst of that celebration of that anniversary is you're saying that the covenant has been a good thing. The covenant, you're evaluating that covenant, and the reason for the celebration is to affirm the covenant. The reason for the celebration is that you're saying that this union that we've taken has been a good thing. It's been something worthy of celebration. It's something that brings joy and fruitfulness and blessing. You're evaluating it, and what it brings is it brings wholeness and it brings goodness. The idea here is that on the Sabbath day you don't do any of your regular work because you take time to celebrate, and in the celebration you affirm the covenant. That was what Israel did, and what they were called to do in the Old Testament covenant. They were called to affirm this, and that's what the Sabbath did. Now, the idea that Jesus bringing healing and goodness, is not an appropriate celebration of the unity between God and people, is it's absurd, to the point of being a farce. It's missing the point completely. And so that's been the nature of the conflict here with Jesus and the Pharisees. Now, this is an important thing to understand, because what this means is that it's not as if the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are evaluating Jesus' ministry and trying to decide whether it's from God or not. The issue is that they are at a fundamental, there's a fundamental conflict. They're fundamentally opposed to one another, this religious leaders and their desires, and Jesus and his kingdom. There's a fundamental opposition here. So when they come to him to test him, they're not, we shouldn't read that as, oh, well, they're trying to figure out whether or not Jesus is actually from God. No, the test is to try to get him to trip up. So they ask him to show them a sign. Now, why can we assume that this is disingenuous? Well, what has Jesus been doing his whole ministry? He's been healing. He's been proclaiming good news to the poor. He's been giving sight to the blind. He's been giving hearing to the deaf. He's been treating the crippled, making the lame walk. He's been doing all of these things throughout his ministry. There's been an unending progression of signs. And in fact, I remember when Jesus was born, in the announcement of his birth, it said, "This will be a sign to you. You will find the child wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." So Jesus is himself a sign. What is Jesus a sign of? Jesus is a sign of the inauguration of the kingdom. Jesus is a sign of the inauguration of the union of God to his people and in spirit. Okay, so this is kind of an important thing. So you can think about it from this perspective. Let's say this. Let's say that you go to school for the first time. Remember, you go to kindergarten. And when you go to kindergarten, the teacher sits you down and there's a list of rules for the classroom. And you can probably remember some of these. Keep your hands and feet to yourself. Raise your hand to talk. There's probably another one I remember that I got in trouble for many, many times, was keep all 4 feet of the chair on the floor. Remember, you couldn't lean back in your chairs, you couldn't tip them back. I was always getting in trouble for that one. So you have this list of rules. And when you're a kindergartner, you're constantly having to be reminded of the rules, because they are a foreign. They're a foreign concept to you. You don't understand it. They're not part of you yet. Now, hopefully, let's say you get to college And when you walk into a college class, hopefully that same list of rules that's maybe been on, every wall growing up, maybe they started disappearing in high school, hopefully. But if they didn't, at least by the time you're in college, those rules aren't there anymore. Hopefully by that time you actually have the spirit of the rules in you, and you understand that there are times when you understand the purpose of the rules enough to know what the spirit of the rule is, and to follow the spirit of the rule into places that the letter of the rule doesn't have the sophistication to govern. So as an example, you might have a professor ask a question. And if you are in tune with the spirit of the rule enough, you know when the question that the professor is asking, you know when that question is rhetorical and when it's seeking an answer. And so you might give out an answer without raising your hand, and you do so with a knowledge of the fact that you're not going to do that when somebody else is speaking, because you have that spirit of not wanting to interrupt. You have the spirit of wanting to cooperate with the teacher. You have the spirit of wanting to cooperate with the classmates. You have the spirit of wanting the class to be as good as it can so that you can learn and so that other people can learn. So at some point you have the spirit of the classroom inside of you. And when you have the spirit of the classroom inside of you, then you don't need that list of external rules. There's a greater, you see, when you have the list of rules, what's unified is the desire or the purpose of the classroom and your external behavior. But once you have the spirit of the classroom in you, then there's a greater unity between the spirit or the desire or the purpose of the classroom and you. Because now it's not just your external behavior that's united with the purpose of the classroom, it's everything in you. So what Jesus is doing is he's coming to inaugurate the kingdom, and he is a sign of that inauguration. So what he's saying to the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that you guys are the religious leaders, you guys are the people who are supposed to have things under control here, and you don't have this sense to see that what the times are. You can look at the weather and you can tell what's going on there, but you can't look at what God is doing in the world. Now, the question we might ask ourselves is, why couldn't the Pharisees and the Sadducees do that? And the answer is because they had an agenda that was outside of the spirit of the kingdom of God. So somebody who has an agenda that's outside of the classroom might come in and try to commandeer the classroom for their own purposes. They might find themselves at odds with the classroom. In the same way, what's happening with the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that they have an agenda that's outside of the kingdom and is bringing them into conflict and not allowing them to see what's happening. They can't see the sign that they're looking for because their agenda doesn't allow them. Well, what's the agenda? Well, you can kind of think about it in similar terms to what's happening today. So the Pharisees, they have an agenda. What's their agenda? Well, they're kind of like the conservatives of the day. They very much believe in a bodily resurrection, and they believe in the scriptures. They believe in a lot of things. And they were kind of the conservatives of the day. They were very much against the foreign influences that are going on in the Jewish world. They're very much against the breakdown as they see of culture and society. They want to restore those things. Now, the Sadducees are much different. They don't believe that there's going to be a resurrection. They don't believe in heaven and hell. They don't believe in a lot of those things. They only believe in a few of the scriptures, and they're very okay with cooperating with the Greek and foreign influence that's in their world at that time. So because there's a kind of a very conservative, nationalistic agenda with the Pharisees, and there's a liberal kind of international agenda with the Sadducees, neither one of them can see the kingdom. Now, in verse 4, it's important. It says, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So why does an evil and adulterous generation seek for a sign? Well, because if they weren't evil and adulterous, they would understand what's going on and what God has been doing this whole time. I mean, God's been with them for hundreds, thousands of years, and yet they still don't know what's going on. They're basically like, hey, it's basically like they've been sitting in class for years and years and years, and they still can't pass the test. They need the cheat sheet, and so that's what they're asking for. And basically Jesus is saying, well, if you hadn't been bad students this whole time, you wouldn't need this. And he says nothing will be given except for the sign of Jonah, the idea that Jesus is going to be in the grave and then 3 days later he's going to rise, and that's what the sign that they're going to get is. So the problem here is that these people's own personal agendas, things that have nothing to do with God but have smaller scopes to them. For the Jewish, for the Pharisees, the scope is the nation, and for the Sadducees, the scope is the individual. The Pharisees are after national glory, and the Sadducees, in a large way, are after personal glory. But both of those fall short of the glory of the kingdom of God. Because of that, they are not able to see what's going on. It's a lesson for us to not take smaller things and turn them into what our life is built around. So thanks for joining us today. We'll see you guys next time.